I would say 99% of the meeting invites I get, no one ever asks me how I want to meet. They either get a video invite, I get a phone invite, or the person just assumes we're defaulting to email. And the thing is, I have a strong preference. And so do most people. Sometimes just asking the other person, like, hey, how'd you prefer to do this? Like, I could do email, phone, video, happy to do whatever's best for you, can be extremely successful strategy because one, you're communicating on their terms. So they're going to be more willing to communicate with you because you do it in the way they want. And two, by just showing you care more about their preferences, it shows you care about the relationship.
All right, let's kick off today's show. Today we're talking with Andrew Brodsky, a leading expert in workplace technology, communication, and productivity. Listen, virtual communication has taken over the world, and Andrew is a management professor at McComb School of Business at the University of Texas, Austin, and the CEO of Ping Group. His latest book, Ping, The Secrets of Successful Virtual Communication, is out, and today he shares his Ping framework for effective virtual communication. How to win back productivity and be more visible virtually, why you need to be reconnecting with your network, and the secret to effectively connecting with the people you look up to. Welcome to the show, Andrew. It's great to have you.
Thanks for having me on.
I know we've all been there, overthinking an email, regretting a text message, wishing the meeting was actually in person instead of on Zoom. Why do so many of us struggle with virtual communication?
There's a lot of answers to that question, but the simplest one is that if you think about humanity, we've had well over 100,000 years of interacting with each other in person. We've evolved to interact in person. And if you look at the amount of time we've spent interacting via technology, it's just this tiny sliver of human history. So just not something we're naturally good at.
Yeah, and I think in the last 20 years that we've been coaching people on communication, the rise of virtual communication and the number of platforms we're now dealing with it in has just become ever present. Whereas I think, when we first started this 20 years ago, it was like email and text, but now you could pretty much be reachable on anything digital.
Exactly. And it's funny seeing some things make a comeback. Like voicemails used to be a big thing. We call people, we leave a message. Then it fell really out of fashion. It's still seen as really bad, but now voice notes are really cool. So, which is basically the same thing as a voicemail. They're both asynchronous or not real time audio. But voice note, you're cool. Voicemail, you're really uncool.
I'm happy that you're here so we can learn some new rules and how to go about this because even though AJ's correct, when we started this podcast and this company, it was at the very beginning of all of these platforms. We were still in MySpace days, yeah, and in it. So we watched then Twitter and Facebook and everything else develop. And as you mentioned, voice memos or voice notes are the new cool thing. And of course, everyone now has their preferred method of communication. When I get voice notes from people, I lose my mind because that's not how I want to communicate. And in fact, I've been working with TikTok, and how you're supposed to interact with TikTok is talking to it like FaceTime. Now, when I was a young man, I dreamed about having FaceTime so I could talk with my high school friends all night long. The thought of getting on FaceTime now to talk to anybody in my adult life uh, seriously irks me. Can't we just send a couple texts back and forth? So this will be quite interesting.
Yeah, I think it would be helpful for our audience to sort of
Mhm.
start to categorize and think about the different forms of communication because we're all aware using them, but we oftentimes make mistakes not really using the right one in the right moment. And I know in the book you lay it out in a beautiful quadrant for us to really understand, what are some of the ways we can think about communicating virtually more effectively?
There's this overarching category that researchers refer to as media richness, which is effectively how close things are to in person, how similar it is to an in person interaction. And then there's underlying categories of that. So it's not just one dimension. And in the book, I highlight the two main ones. The first one's the one most people focus on, and that's cue variety. So, is there similar amounts, similar types of nonverbal behavior to in person interactions? Can we hear them? Can we see them? The second one is synchronicity. So, is there interaction occurring in real time or is it delayed, like email? And the one big thing people often miss about these categorizations is that even small differences on those dimensions can really change the flow of conversation. So like
Yeah.
video calls, those are actually slightly less synchronous than in person because there's data lags and there's, your data is going over the internet. So there's like fractions of a millisecond that the conversation's lagged. And that can create those awkward silences, the accidental interruptions, the no, you go first that happens. So even small changes on those dimensions can have pretty major outcomes.
We've been there even on this show with virtual communication, especially with three of us trying to get a point in there where that tiny delay, as slight as it is in video, you're still now awkwardly talking over someone, whereas in person, it would flow a lot more naturally.
Mm-hmm.
So, as we think about communication from a social dimension, but then in a professional dimension, are there different ways of thinking about how to go about utilizing virtual communication? Or, as Johnny was sharing earlier, is it just come down to personal preference?
Now, there's a ton of research and studies on this about what mode is best for different things. Some people have really strong views towards one extreme or the other. So some people are like, in person is always best. There are other people who are like, in person is pretty much always worst. We should just do text and email. And both extremes are really wrong. So if you have hours and hours of wasted meetings a week, you can easily see why in person or synchronous interactions can be a waste. But on the other side, text based communication can have its downsides, like this conversation. You're asking me a bunch of questions. I'm really talkative. So, I'm answering with a few paragraphs for each. It's going to take us an hour. If you would email me all these questions and I was typing up a few paragraph long answers and proofing them and editing them, it'd take me a week to write up the answers to all of these questions. So, like, this is one of those examples where text based communication would be highly unproductive for our conversation.
And not just productivity, because I know that's the professional side of things, but even on the social realm, some of those conversations can be awkward if it's just over email versus, hey, pick up the phone. And I know for me, I've sort of defaulted more to text in my form of communication. Are you seeing generational differences too now with this infusion of tech?
Yeah, so it's two questions there. One's about authenticity and the other's about generational differences. When it comes to authenticity, it matters what kind of authenticity you're showing. So I differentiate in my research between two types. There's that true authenticity, you're actually feeling what you're trying to show. And in those cases, the richest modes are best. So that's in person or video. But there's a lot of time you're engaging in something that researchers call surface acting. And that's basically you're faking it. So maybe your friend has really good news to tell you, but you're in a bad mood. Maybe you had you spilled coffee on yourself in the morning, you got in a fight with your partner, and you don't want to go to your friend and be like, well, I'd like to say I'm excited about the fact that you just got proposed to, but I spilled coffee on myself, so I'm pissed. Like that would be really, really bad. So in those cases where you need to fake it, potentially for the benefit of the other person, then moving down to audio is better. And that's because it hides all the nonverbal behavior that leaks through when people can see us, but it's not seen as inauthentic like email is. Like to get an email congratulations from your best friend, it just feels bad. And then to the last question, the generational one, yes, things change. For we look like we're all about the same age. For us, when we entered the workforce, email was pretty much the only means of sending text-based communication. You could do it on your phone, but you had to hit the number 2 button 3 times to get to C or the number 5 button, multiple times to get your letter. Like you had to hit texting was not easy. So we used email for everything. The generation now, people coming into, growing up, going to high school and college, they've got lots of options. So they've got texting, they've got Snapchat, and email is only used for work. So for those of us who kind of came into, adulthood with email, we use it for everything. But for younger people, that's seen as really weird because they only use email for work. So there's different norms that everyone associates with these things.
You brought up a point earlier that I know a lot of our clients are frustrated around, and everyone sort of feels like they're drowning in meetings. And it would be nice to default to some of the more asynchronous forms of communication to gain some of that time back. How should we be thinking about these meetings that we're drowning in, and what can we do to potentially speed up communication and win back some time and productivity?
And this is true about all our communication. People are drowning in emails, they're drowning in instant messages, and people often use Slack for that. And they're drowning in all different types of communication. And the problem is that most of us don't stop and think for a few minutes about, is this the best mode to be doing this in? Is this the best mode to be, improving my relationship? Is this the best mode for coming up with a good idea with someone else or collaborating? And by taking a second and pausing and saying, is this the right choice? Like, what would actually be best here? That can really improve people's outcomes, whether it's productivity, whether it's strengthening relationships, whether it's improving your own well being and limiting the overall amount of communication there. So it's about being more thoughtful and strategic in your approach to how you interact with others, as opposed to just going with the default. It's in email, so we're going to continue in email, or it's in text, we're going to continue in text. Instead, maybe pick up the phone or suggest, hey, why don't we switch this to this mode?
That pause brings up a great framework that the book is based around, the ping framework, where we can actually start to think in a more meaningful way about how we're communicating, how we're receiving and responding to communication. So let's unpack the ping framework for our audience.
P is perspective taking, I initiative, N nonverbal, G goals. So P for perspective taking, that's centered around this idea that when we interact virtually, we tend to become much more self-focused. In person, you see a human being standing right in front of you, it's hard to forget about them and how they're going to react. When you're interacting virtually, you're just staring at the text on a screen, or even on video, you're just staring at a small square of the other person. So we tend to be focused more on ourselves and forget about them. That's why we so often say things virtually we wouldn't if the person was standing right in front of us. So it's key to put yourself in the other person's shoes. I is initiative. And the central point behind this is that each mode of interaction has strengths and weaknesses, but we don't need to accept those weaknesses as fixed. And well, it's just worse. So, for instance, email, texting, there tends to be a lot less small talk in those modes of interaction than there is in person, which undermines trust, which reduces rapport, which can hurt relationships. So rather than just saying, well, email is worse for building relationships, thinking about, well, how can I infuse a little bit of small talk in there? Not just adding in 10 paragraphs and like really bothering the other person, but maybe just a sentence or two can really help to improve the relationship by reminding that other person, hey, there's a human being on the other side of the screen. N, nonverbal. And that gets to the idea that there's so many different cues that happen across different modes that we aren't used to. Typos can relay emotion in email. Time of day you send a message can relay power. Even on video, there's questions about your background. Should you be looking at the other person's screen? Should you be looking at your webcam? Should you be looking at yourself? There are all these different nonverbal behaviors, and there's a lot of science behind them that shows what is best. What should we be doing? And then lastly is G for goals. I wish I could say there was just one best mode of communication. It'd make for some easy advice in a short book, but there isn't. It really depends on your goal for the situation. So we've already talked about productivity and relationships. Sometimes certain modes are better for productivity, but they're worse for building relationships, and vice versa. One of those examples is often I get is, are cameras on better or cameras off better? And research shows that it depends on what your goal is for that situation. And together that brings together this framework: perspective taking for P, initiative for I, nonverbal for N, and G for goals.
Now, so many of us feel that now with this infusion of virtual communication, there's this always on mentality where in the past, and I remember setting up my dad's answering machine, a call would come in and we could screen it and we could be sitting there and hear the person's voice leaving the actual voice message. And then my dad would be like, you know what, I'm busy right now with dinner. I'll call him back after dinner. And there was always this pause that allowed us to enjoy our family time. And as now this mode of virtual communication has come into play, there's this always on constant notifications on every device to let you know that you have to be responding to this communication. How do we start to infuse some boundaries around the communication and win our life back? Because I think that's where a lot of people's pain points are with virtual communication.
When I'm consulting with leaders, that's probably one of the most common ones I get is how do we get out from under this load of stuff? And I have a lot of tips for this, but the one core one that I focus on often is trying to make the implicit explicit when it comes to response expectations in your relationships, whether that's work or social. And what this means is it's really based on this previous research on something called the email urgency bias. And what these researchers found was that when people receive emails, especially after hours, they tend to think the sender wants a response much quicker than they do. So if I were to get an email from one of you two, late night on a weekday, I'd be like, oh, this is a really important person, like has a big podcast, does all this work, consulting books. I'd be like, they probably want a response really quickly. But in your side, you're probably like, I'm dealing with 100 emails right now. I don't care if Andrew gets back to me for another week or two. And this can create a tremendous amount of stress on the part of the recipient because we always feel this need to be checking our inbox, whether it's instant message, texting, email, and responding right away. And it turns out very often the other person doesn't care if you get back to them that quickly. So one of the things that I do, and when I'm coaching teams or people in relationships, is to talk about, okay, what are the expectations for each mode of communication? Maybe we'll say that email will respond within 24 hours. Instant messaging will respond within 2 hours. That way, if you're focused on something, you're in a meeting, no big deal. And then if there's an emergency, either during hours, something urgent, or after hours, it'll be via text. And this is nice both for the sender and recipient, because on the recipient side, if you're done with work or you don't want to look at your phone, all you need to do is listen for that text notification, and you don't have to check your inbox every second. And on the sender side, we often fall into this trap of, especially in relationships, where you text someone and they haven't responded. And you're like, are they ignoring me? Are they, keeping me on red? Do they not care? And it's the same with emails and work is, did someone read my email? Are they ignoring me? And when you have these pre-existing conversations and you suddenly hit that amount of time you've previously talked about, it's not weird to follow back up. You can just be like, hey, didn't hear from you the last day. What's up? And so when you make the implicit explicit with regard to those norms, it can really reduce the stress and burden on both sides of the equation.
And that urgency bias, we've seen it in our clients too, consulting with them and sharing, how they look at communication, it ratchets up. So I was working with an executive who had a team and, he also had a day job. So he was typically handling his team's emails in the evening after normal working hours. And of course, that led to his team immediately responding with urgency because they're feeling that urgency bias. The boss, the owner of the company is emailing me after hours. And then he was complaining he was getting no family time because he's now responding back to those urgent emails at midnight. And just taking a simple step back and saying, does this have to be answered now? Can this be answered with my morning cup of coffee before I start my day job? Created that breathing room. And then all of a sudden he found he wasn't getting as many emails late at night to respond to. And you can break that chain.
We often all have our own views on these things, and no one ever has a conversation out loud saying, okay, let's figure this out just so we're clear on like what our expectations are here. And it really takes so much weight off everyone when you actually have those conversations.
And then adding that hierarchy, even internally for us. So most of our email is for communication with people outside the company. Slack is for all the internal communication. And then if for some reason it's really urgent, then it's a text or a phone call to Johnny or myself or a team member that pierces through. Okay, AJ is not using Slack. He really wants to get hold of me. I should probably figure out what's going on here. And that's allowed us to at least level the playing field on the communication instead of feeling like every Slack notification at all hours of the day has to be responded to.
And that rejuvenation is key. There's so much research showing that when you don't have separation from your communication, your work, that it really just burns you out. You decrease creativity, you're less satisfied with your job, you can't focus as much. So making sure that you have that space to detach is really important.
Even for myself and hearing that hierarchy is like, why are we doing this to ourselves? Why are we going through all this? However, when you're dealing with lots of different people in a company that has many different things going on, there are going to be multiple ways of communicating to get things done. And it helps productivity. So, it may sound a bit insane, uh, but when you're using this stuff all the time, it absolutely makes sense to have that hierarchy there, and it just keeps things straightened out. You'll feel much better rather than allowing yourself to get stressed out from trying to figure out how to deal with all of this incoming.
Well, I think part of what also happens without the hierarchy and that urgency bias is then it's really hard to have the perspective taking pause and really think, how's the other person thinking or feeling? It's very easy to think, oh, they're upset with me, or read too much into it and focus on the I as that urgency and that pressure from all this communication builds. So what are some ways that we can start to be more adept at perspective taking in these moments in the past where maybe that notification has created anxiety?
One of my favorite research studies on this topic focuses on something called egocentrism over email. It's this idea that we become very self focused over email. And the example that's used is in a study that was done by a Stanford researcher where she had two different people get paired up. One of them would tap out a song on, a desk, and then they asked that person, "How confident are you that the other person will guess the song that you tapped out?" And they would say, "Oh yeah, really confident, 80%, 90%." And almost always the other person never got it right. The reason was that when you're tapping out the song, you hear the music in your head while you're tapping it. And so it seems obvious. For the person on the other side, all they hear is tap, 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 tap. And that doesn't yield anything. And the parallel is made to the same thing with text based communication. When we're writing a message, we hear the emotion in our heads. It seems super obvious to us. But on the recipient side, they're coming from a completely different set of assumptions, information, and they interpret it differently. An example I give in the book when I was doing interviews with a publishing company is this manager sent an email saying, you know, good job on this, but I think we can continue to improve it. Smiley face. And the subordinate was like, this was a super condescending email. Like, this is just me doing the work. The fact that we're saying we, the emoticon was very condescending to me. And the idea here is that we both hear it different ways. And the research on email showed a similar thing to the tapping study. The senders think it's obvious, the recipients don't get it right. But there's a twist on this study in that they found that when, as a sender, you take a second and you read your message out loud in the opposite tone you intended. So if it's a sarcastic message, read it out loud to yourself as serious. If it's serious message, read it as sarcastic. If it's happy, read it as angry, and vice versa. And when people did that, they suddenly realized, oh, wait, my message is not as clear as I intended. So getting in the habit for important conversations, I wouldn't recommend this for every single message, but for those where you're concerned, they might misinterpret, or it's an important one, just reading it out loud in the opposite tone you intended can make us suddenly realize that, wow, we were in our own heads and that may not be as clear as I meant. And then they fix it.
There's a couple examples that illustrate this very much. So the first one, you were talking about publishing. We could talk about music publishing for a second. Ask the drummer how much they get in music publishing, right? You
Yeah.
don't get any money as a drummer, right? Unless you get added into one of the writers of the songs. The melody lines and the lyrics get the money. So that settles the tapping of a pen and how that works. And then the other thing is, I've been seeing a lot of articles lately, and of because I am on TikTok, I see a lot of how the younger kids interact, and Gen Z hates the thumbs up. The thumbs up to them is the most sarcastic. They can't stand it. They see it as, uh, yeah, it's just bad sarcasm, and they want to shove that thumb up everyone's ass. So just to go along with the emojis, yeah, we attribute to them different meanings.
And that's why having these open conversations is so useful, because getting everyone on the same page can be really valuable in any relationship, because people have different approaches to communication, different ways they're interpreting it. And this is related to emotion too. If there's a potential for misinterpretation, aside from getting your message right, actually be more explicit about it. Say, I'm excited, as opposed to just assuming the other person gets where you're going with it. Spell it out more clearly, and you could avoid a whole lot of the misinterpretations that cause a lot of trouble.
Another struggle that a lot of our clients face, and probably a lot of listeners too, is with this rise of productivity and everyone seeking to be as productive as possible, especially as we've moved to a remote and hybrid work environment. We've now sacrificed productivity for actual communication and visibility. And we think we're getting a lot done, but out of sight, out of mind, and not communicating well what's going on, we lose that visibility, and then we're getting passed over for promotion and frustrated that other people who are less productive seem to be moving ahead of us in the workforce. So, what are some strategies that we can utilize around virtual communication to showcase some of the productivity in a more meaningful way and increase our visibility so we don't fall into that trap of being out of sight and being judged as negative, not getting work done?
Yeah, I could probably talk about this topic for an hour by itself, but let me give like the key things here. The parallel I like to give is, there's like the old saying that I'm going to mess up, but if a tree falls in the forest or woods and there's no one there to hear it, did it actually make a sound? It's kind of the same thing for a remote worker is if a remote worker does a really good job on a task, but no one's heard about it, did they actually complete the task? So this means that communication is even more important when you're interacting with someone from a distance. If you have a manager walking around, they can see what you're doing. You don't have to communicate it to them. If you have a relationship with someone and you're in person, they could see how engaged you are in the conversation. You don't have to communicate it to them. But when we're interacting with others at a distance, we need to provide that information. Communication ends up being the filter through which people see your effort and see your engagement in any interaction. So that communication is key. One trick that I like to highlight that's pretty simple and doesn't really require extra effort is thinking about that you want to seem present. And let me compare two different people. And I'll use a work example for the moment. There's two employees. One communicates, every week they send their manager on Friday afternoon a 5-paragraph long email about what they did for the week. The other employee, at the end of each day, sends their manager a few sentence email about what they did for that day. Which employee do you feel like will feel more present and more productive to that manager? It's the one who sends their manager a few sentences each day. And here's the thing, that employee is not necessarily any more productive. In fact, both employees send the exact same amount of communication, right? We got a few paragraphs versus a few sentences one day a week versus a few sentences each day a week. So the absolute amount of communication didn't change, but the frequency did. And by showing that, hey, I'm here today, I did something today, that creates this perception on the other side that the person was more active. And it's unfortunate that this is necessary. If I was just talking to leaders, I could provide recommendations about how to avoid this need for productivity theater. But for all of us who aren't CEOs, the unfortunate truth of it is that everyone enjoys a little bit of theater. And the only way in many cases that managers, friends, whoever else can understand your engagement when you're not physically in person is in the way you communicate with them.
And those outcomes, especially when they're collaborative, they're hard to determine who played what role and how much effort was put in by everyone. So in that absence of communication, I know for a lot of our introverts, they're like, oh man, I got to send an email every day. I'm trying to avoid communicating. Well, you're actually killing the visibility that leads to getting ahead, that allows that collaborative effort you put in on that outcome to actually shine through for leadership to make the promotion, to make the recommendation.
When people aren't in person, there's an illusion that they're working harder. This is called often the FaceTime bias. And there's this idea that when people see people working or see people in the office, they assume they're working harder, even though that's not necessarily true. There's a fun study on the input bias where they had people evaluate one of two different presentations. In one of the cases, they heard this presentation, the person spent over 8 hours making it. For the other set of people, they heard they only spent about 20 minutes making this presentation. And participants in the study, the evaluators, rated when they heard the presentation that the person spent over 8 hours preparing, they rated that as better than the one they heard the person spent only 20 minutes preparing. But it was the same presentation. And this is the thing, which employee do you want or which person do you want? The one who gets the job done in 20 minutes or the one who takes over 8 hours? But we reward the person who took over 8 hours because it seems better because they put so much effort into it. And we're not really good at objectively evaluating things that, for the most part, don't have clear numbers about what makes it better or worse. So it's not so much that in person makes people work harder or that it makes them more productive. It's just people, managers, they can feel like they can observe it. So it makes them more confident in their ability to evaluate others, even when they may be biased in those evaluations.
Now, a blind spot that comes up around that frequent communication, uh, especially for our clients who have bosses, and then we can talk about reaching out to strangers, is this belief that, oh, it's the boss. They're so busy. They don't want to be bothered with my daily email. They don't want to be bothered with my daily message. And then that also goes to, well, that stranger is so busy. I can't reach out to them and make a request or ask something of them. So we choose not to send that message. And it's, again, robbing our visibility. So how do we actually start to level the playing field so we're not in this hierarchy, assuming people are too busy for this communication?
One of my colleagues here, actually, the University of Texas, has done some research on this, and they've shown that people overestimate how awkward it is to reach out to more distant contacts. And then, they do it. And then after the fact, they're like, well, how awkward was it actually? And they're like, oh, it was far better than I thought. And they ask the second question too is what mode is best and which one's most awkward? And generally, people tended to feel that email would have been the least awkward. Phones next more awkward, and then video or in person is the most awkward because it's richer, it feels weirder, whereas email feels much lower stakes. And what they found was that participants indicated that afterwards, phone, video, and in person weren't any more awkward than email, actually, even though they predicted they would be. But interestingly, in the context of connecting with an old friend or colleague, visual interaction, so video in person, didn't end up adding anything beyond phone. So the idea here is just the big jump was moving from asynchronous email to synchronous phone. And then moving to video call actually didn't add to anything in those conversations about how much they felt they gained from it, and how much trust they built. So sometimes just picking up the phone can be one of the best things you can do. I wouldn't recommend necessarily cold calling people because you're going to feel like you're interrupting them, but maybe sending a quick text saying, I'd love to catch up over phone. Do you have a few minutes in the next few weeks? It'd be great to chat. Can be a lower stakes way than kind of forcing a video call where they have to be sitting in their office. And leading with that text, but having the richer interaction can help to strengthen that relationship.
For a lot of the cold outreach, the type of message you send has a huge impact. And I was recently working with one of our clients who was putting together some messaging seeking investors, and he got a database of some people he was basically cold outreaching to, some real stretches in there. And as he sent out dozens and dozens of messages, he actually accidentally sent one to a billionaire who owned a massive building that he was hoping to reach. He was hoping to get someone else on his team, but he actually sent it directly to the billionaire. And within minutes, the billionaire responded. And I find that so often the people who are the most successful, the busiest, actually get less of those messages because of this bias where everyone assumes they're too busy. I'm not going to message them. But if you actually follow through, you're more likely to get that quick response. And it's sort of counterintuitive, but a lot of the really busy, successful people, they have EAs who can very quickly go through their email, discern, hey, this is an opportunity, make a quick recommendation that they actually reply. So you're actually doing yourself a disservice by assuming that person's too busy for this communication.
We had done a podcast with Ben from The Buried Life, and here's him and his boys on MTV getting a show playing basketball with Obama and doing all these outrageous stunts. And their whole bit about that was just they would start with just sending some random emails to folks. Here's what we're doing. Here's what we'd like to do. Would you like to be a part of this? And they were always blown away by the amount of people that actually responded and were like, hey, this sounds rad. And would always be surprised of who was so difficult to get in touch with. And it was always a mind blower from them. And we had some fun discussing that with them. So another example of how that proves out.
Yeah. So what does the science say around that bias that we have, or the blind spot that we have around people being too busy to respond? And then what are the most effective messages to break through that noise?
One of the examples that's coming to mind too is some research on reaching out to people who could use support. So maybe someone's going through something really bad with their family, or they've got cancer or something else. What the research has found is that people often feel uncomfortable doing that because they feel awkward. They think the other person won't necessarily appreciate them reaching out of the blue. And it turns out that we're all completely wrong about that on average. When you reach out to someone who could use some support, it turns out that they really appreciate it. And that can make a really big difference. Because so often, so many people are afraid to reach out that it can be very isolating when you end up in one of those situations. Even if it's someone you're really distantly connected to, that can make a huge difference in the relationship. And then that is a great way too to like strengthen that bond, strengthen that relationship while doing something nice. Now, in terms of the messages, just moving more broadly, whether it's someone needs support or you want a business opportunity, the big thing is that people on the other side make assessments based on the effort you put into the interaction. So in my own research, I've shown that people will tend to discount email as inauthentic because it is so low effort. Whereas higher levels of communication, whether that's phone or even better, video in person, it seems higher effort on your part. Whether or not they want to engage in that joint effort with you is a different question. And the other big thing is you want to make sure to personalize your communication. I get so many emails from all over the world that are either completely form template that do not mention anything personal about me that were sent out to like 2,000 plus professors. I get an email from someone who's from some random country who's studying healthcare and nothing related to my research. And they're like, I would love to come to your school to collaborate with you. And like, clearly you haven't researched that. And the new thing, of course, is AI. We had a high school student who reached out to my department, or everyone in my department actually, asking to do research. And the message was clearly written by AI. And it was, dear professor, one line about one of your papers, form email. And one of us mentioned it to the other person in our department. And we all got the same AI, basically form email to every single one of us. And the problem with this is, if we're going to work with someone, we want to be someone who's really motivated, interested in our kind of research. We don't want them throwing spaghetti at the wall to see what sticks. So making sure that your message is truly personalized, especially if you're going to someone big or someone important, is going to be what gets you through the filter.
And actionable. I find oftentimes we put so much effort in trying to explain what it is that we are and our credentials and why we need them and why we're hoping to connect with them and what the similarities are. And then we forget the most important part, which is like, what is the simple action that the receiver of this message can take, who's time-starved and busy, to move things forward? And I'm in the same boat. I know Johnny is too. We see emails all the time. Dear bracket name, bracket, comma, all right, here's our pitch. And then there's no action. There's no call to action. There's something specific and simple that I can say yes or no to. Okay, a 5-minute call or a 2-minute demo. Time and time again, it's a lot of fluff around why they want to talk to us. I heard this thing on the podcast. My AI transcriber said, reach out to you because of this. but there's no clear action for me to take. And then it just goes into the recycling bin and I'm on to the next email and trying to get to inbox zero. So one of the key lessons that we always share with our clients who are trying to break through the noise in this environment is, hey, keep brevity at the front of this email around what's the connecting point, and then make sure the action that the person can take to help you is clear. It's not picking their brain, it's not hours of effort on their end, or it's not nebulous for them to figure out.
Hmm. And there's a good strategy that's related called, which I'm guessing you two probably talked about, the foot in the door technique, which is you start with a small request. And especially for people who are busy, they're not going to want to do something huge initially, but just getting a small initial connection where they give something small to you, whether it's a little bit of time or a little bit of something, that opens the door to a bigger relationship, to bigger requests. Because now they feel like, one, they've helped you, they know you, but now they sunk time into this relationship. So it has more value to them than someone who's just emailing them out of the blue.
Yeah, and those relationships build when you actually respond to how their response helped you, impacted you, what changed, what you tried, what you applied. That actually leads to mentorship. And so many of my mentorship opportunities, both being mentored and then mentoring others, started with very small requests that led to, hey, you took initiative, you took action, my advice actually helped you in some way. So let's keep trading information, let's keep developing this relationship. And now they've become lifelong mentors through a very simple ask in the beginning.
And one of the hesitations I often see with people wanting to ask for advice is they're concerned it's going to make them look incompetent, that they're asking for something to make them seem low power. What studies out at Harvard have actually shown is that asking for advice makes you seem more rather than less competent. The reason being is that on the receiver side, you're basically flattering them by saying, "Oh, you're the expert. I want to come to you." And the receiver is also like, "Wow, this person has a really good head on their shoulders that they know the best person to come to for advice." Right? Like they know just who to ask here. So in those ways, it actually can make you seem more rather than less competent when you're engaging those kind of interactions, which is the fear that many people have is it's going to make them look bad for asking in the first place.
Specificity here is also really helpful. So, for a lot of professors, authors, content creators who've probably done a video on that, or written a book on that, or an article on that, for you to ask a very surface level question that shows you didn't take the time to consume what they already put out there and ask their time to help you specifically, that's actually going to have a lower likelihood of succeeding. But if you tell me that you listen intently to this Toolbox episode and in this one part, I said something that grabbed you that you'd like a little clarification on, I'm much more inclined to respond to you because you've shown that you put in the time and the effort to solve this for yourself or find the answer. And we find so many times we're getting general questions that, well, we covered that 10 episodes ago. It's publicly available if you just checked out the YouTube channel.
And knowing that the value goes to the person that you're asking the favor or the request of, I like to inflate it a bit or inflate them a bit, knowing how that works. So, hey, I'm coming to you because I really appreciate your perspective on things, and I'm looking forward to hear what you have to say about this. Here's the question I have, which even makes them even more excited to answer or to help you out.
Bring this all back to virtual communication. One of the tips I have that's also related to perspective taking, I would say 99% of the meeting invites I get, no one ever asks me how I want to meet. They either get a video invite, I get a phone invite, or the person just assumes we're defaulting to email. This happened a lot with reporters for the book. Some of them wanted to talk on the phone. Some of them wanted to email me 20 questions that I would answer over email. And the thing is, I have a strong preference, and so do most people. And one of the easiest strategies that people so often miss when making these new connections or just interacting with everyone is one, yes, in ongoing teams and relationships, it's good to kind of strategize, figure out what's the most productive mode or the best mode. But sometimes just asking the other person, like, hey, how'd you prefer to do this? Like, I could do email, phone, video, happy to do whatever's best for you, can be extremely successful strategy because one, you're communicating on their terms. So they're going to be more willing to communicate with you because you do it in the way they want. And two, by just showing you care more about their preferences, it shows you care about the relationship. It signals there that, hey, I care about this relationship because I'm going to do it in the way that you want to, what's best for you, because the same thing isn't everyone's favorite.
We've also seen that bias to everyone's too busy to respond hurt the relationships that have fallen to the wayside. We understand that things get in the way. Maybe you started a family, maybe moved to a new location, or you got a new job, and then you didn't keep up your communication with a relationship that's important to you. And it feels often the longer you go without that communication, the harder it is to reinitiate. So, what does science say around reinitiating those relationships through communication? And what are some strategies our listeners can do right now with those relationships that I know we all have in our phone?
Well, first is we tend to think that other person won't value the communication as much, especially when it comes to these friendships and relationships. You think it'll be intrusive, it'll be awkward. In reality, people, it's nice when you show that you care about the other person, right? When someone messages me who I knew or lost connection with, and they're like, hey, I was just thinking about you, be great to reconnect. I don't have any, I don't need anything. I just, would love to hear your voice. Or, I'd love to hear what you've been up to. That can really show that you care about the relationship. A fun example during COVID, LeBron James texted his teammates, miss you guys. Can't wait to get back on the floor with you guys, finish what we started. And like, that was big for his teammates. They were talking about it during interviews afterwards. And sometimes just that little touch can be really meaningful when it comes to those interactions.
It's also challenging then to pick up the communication thereafter. Sometimes it feels good to send that I'm thinking of you, but then how do we actually get that person back in communication?
I think at that point you could just say, I'd love to talk to you on the phone. I'm flexible. Is there, anytime I just want to catch up, hear what you've been up to. Just trying to use again, this foot in the door. We start with a small interaction, something that doesn't interrupt what they're doing, a text message or an email. And then just asking for that richer interaction and making it clear. And, if we're talking about the context of an existing relationship, making it clear that you just want to reconnect. If we're talking about a cold contact, then it's all those things we already discussed. You want to make sure it's personal. You want to make sure it's not something you can just find on Google or by reading their existing content. You want to make it clear that you want to talk to this person for a reason. It is you I want to talk to. And the one caveat I want to add to all this advice about asking for advice is that there's an important buyer's beware. If you go to someone, you ask for something, whether that's advice, whether that's an investment, and you end up not taking it, it can really harm the relationship. This is that polar opposite of where you're flattering someone by asking for their advice. When you don't take their advice, that shows that they think, wow, this person doesn't know what they're doing because they don't, I know I'm right and they're not doing it, or they don't care about this relationship. And that's one of the quickest ways to burn a bridge. So if you're going to go to someone for something, be ready to take whatever it is or risk ruining that relationship.
That's an incredible point. In fact, AJ brings that up a lot when he gets bothered for mentor work. But young folks need to know that those people in high value positions, they're probably probable givers, and they want to give value. They want to help people. They want to see folks succeed. However, in giving out a lot of advice, they have seen a lot of people squander it and squander their time. And I know even myself, when people ask me about stuff, I immediately go, are you going to watch this if I give you this? Are you going to listen to this if I give you this? Are you going to do this if I give you this? Because if you're not, I'm not interested. And they're like, oh, no. Oh, yeah. I'm right away. Absolutely. Okay. I'll do that all day long. But I'm not interested in entertaining you if you're not going to participate in this. And so when you put yourself out there and you don't get the response that you are hoping for, keep trying. Let them know that you're incredibly engaged and interested, um, because no might be a default just because of how these people have been treated in the past and how their advice and mentorship had fallen on deaf ears.
Not to date ourselves too much, but many of our audience members and clients have expressed frustration to us as well around the death of the water cooler. You know, when I went into my first office job, there was a lot of downtime with my peers where we weren't actually doing the work, but we were engaging in camaraderie and conversation that built and strengthened relationships. And it seems and it feels in virtual environments now that's disappeared. And with that, we feel less ties to our peers and our colleagues at work. What can we do through virtual communication to start to bring back the water cooler and nurture these relationships as they're so impactful in our career?
And I talk to a lot of leaders about culture and org culture and remote work. And there's a lot of things that are happening simultaneously that is not solely due to the remoteness. I see a lot of leaders taking what I call the house arrest approach to fixing culture. So, for those who aren't familiar, House Arrest is a movie from a couple decades ago where basically these parents were divorcing. So, what their kids decided to do is to lock them in a basement until they reconcile. And of course, because it's Hollywood, it worked out all fine and dandy. But in real life, what ends up happening when you lock people who are divorcing into each other into a basement, one may not walk out alive. And this is what they're doing in organizations. They're saying, well, our culture's not good, so we're going to force everyone back into the office. And that just doesn't improve culture. But getting this question about how do we add the water cooler back into virtual? How can we get these more spontaneous interactions? What research shows is that one of the best ways to do this is short video interactions with fewer people. There's a lot of teams, I've seen a lot of organizations where they have these like 3 hour long brainstorming planning meetings with like a large group of people. And that is absolutely one of the worst things you can do for building culture, for building engagement. The meetings that people are and the interactions people are most engaged in, most willing to engage in this kind of small talk in, shorter meetings, fewer people. Those are the ones where you get those good interactions in there. And the other step is just being a little bit more intentional about it. Just because something doesn't, those conversations don't happen as naturally virtually, doesn't mean that you can't incite them. Just asking someone, saying, "Hey, I'm working on this at the moment. I was curious. Are you doing anything related? I'd love to get your thoughts on this." Just have to be a little bit more intentional about it. You have to take that initiative. So that's like that second part of the pink framework there. Taking the initiative to just engage in that small talk, to ask those questions, can fill them back in. There's nothing stopping you from having those conversations just because they don't happen as naturally.
Now, you mentioned nonverbals in virtual communication, and I think so many of our audience members come to us for nonverbals in person communication. What should I do with my hands, and how can I be more warm? What should we be thinking about virtually around our nonverbal communication and being more effective?
First, it's good to learn all the different cues, what they mean, how people interpret them. But if I'm going to give you the quick answer, the one piece of advice that I often recommend, and this is in respect to the question I often get is, should I use emojis? Should I not use emojis? And the research on this is mixed. Sometimes some of these things are good, sometimes they're bad. But one thing is clear is a good strategy is something called language mimicry. So if they use emojis, use them too. If they use exclamation marks, use them too. If they use certain business jargon, you use that kind of thing too. If some other person's using a certain mode of communication, use that too. And the reason this strategy is so effective is twofold. One, we all think we communicate the right way. So when someone communicates like us, then we're like, oh, they're a good communicator. And the other side of that is we trust those who are similar to us. So when someone communicates in a way we understand that we're familiar with, then we tend to trust them more. The two footnotes with this, though, is one, don't overdo it. If you engage in this game of like Simon Says, where you're copying everything they do, that will backfire. And two is if you're very high power, don't try and mimic someone who's low power, because that just comes off as really cringy and bad. But the central point behind this is take your cues from the other person, see what they're doing, and then try and implement them yourself. And that's the safest route you can take if you haven't really done a deep dive into kind of the research and science and all this stuff.
Well, thank you for this wonderful virtual conversation. Where can our audience find out more about your book and the research that you do?
Yeah, my book, Ping, The Secrets of Successful Virtual Communication, is available wherever books are sold. My company, Ping Group, on our website, pinggroup.org, we have additional free resources. So communication styles tests, team norming tools for communication, getting to what we talked about. And yeah, those are my two most common resources. And you can find me on LinkedIn as well.
Thank you for joining us.
Great. Thanks for having me. It's a great conversation.